Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azzawi. Iraq is hell on earth for its people and an awful nightmare for reporting journalists. Paralyzed by fear and violence, are we getting an accurate picture by reporters who have become the favorite targets for militias and terrorists? Sectarian polarization is forcing Iraqi journalists to choose sides. But are they spewing poisonous hatred into the Iraqi body politics? Imran Khan reports.
Since the start of war in 2003, Iraq has become one of the most dangerous countries on the planet. 153 journalists and media assistants have been killed since the start of fighting. Reporting in Iraq carries very real risk. Tariq Ayoub, Al Jazeera's correspondent during the initial invasion, was killed when a missile hit the Al Jazeera office. This happened despite Al Jazeera providing the American forces with the location. In a final act of friendship, his colleagues carry away his body, well aware that they could be next. No such act of friendship for Atwa Bejit. In February 2006, she went with her cameraman to cover an event much like this one. They were dragged away by gunmen and executed. Just two stories in a grim roll call that goes on and on. Both Western and non-Western journalists have suffered. Western journalists have all but retreated to their compounds, rarely leaving for fear of violence. So how do we see these pictures that populate the news bulletins every day? Well, it's local Iraqis that have taken up the mantle, shooting the pictures and taking the risk, often for little money and even less recognition. Without journalists in Iraq, we wouldn't know what was going on, but the risks are huge. But at least the journalists can come back home. It's different for our Iraqi comrades, however. Their home is a war zone. Imran Khan for Inside Iraq.
To appreciate the risk facing reporting journalists working in Iraq, I'm joined from Amman, Jordan, by John Burns, the New York Times Baghdad bureau chief, and from Erbil, Iraq, by Ismail Zair, editor-in-chief of Al Sabah Al Jadid newspaper, The New Morning, and from Boston by Jewel Campania, Senior Program Coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Iraq. Mr. Burns, let me start with you. Literally, you just arrived from Baghdad into Amman. How difficult is it for journalists, whether Western or Iraqis, to report the story from Baghdad?
Well, I think your report was absolutely correct about one thing, and that is that the biggest risks by far fall on the shoulders of Iraqi journalists. That's to say, Iraqis working for Iraqi media and Iraqis working for Western media. We ourselves had one of our Iraqi reporters killed only 3 weeks ago, Khalid Hassan. We don't know why he was killed, but a very strong possibility is that he was killed because he was working for the New York Times or for Americans. It's a very dangerous place. It's the most dangerous place by far in which the New York Times has operated in my 30 years at the newspaper. But it needs to be said that the challenge for the journalist in Iraq is that what Americans would call the workarounds. That's to say, to find ways of continuing to report despite the hazards. And one part of your report I didn't agree with was that we've been driven back into our compounds where we stay. It's very difficult for television crews because by the very nature they're very visible, they have a lot of equipment, they have a number of personnel on the street. For us it's a good deal easier. One person, if they're female, are very often wearing a abaya. We can be less visible, and we do go out, and we do go out every day. Do we go out cautioned? Yes, we're very, very careful, but we're out there, and we think we can still report pretty effectively on what's happening in Iraq. And
yet, Mr. Zair, the brunt of that risk and the death is carried by the Iraqis. Disproportionately, Iraqi journalists, TV people, and even executive within TV stations and radio stations, they have suffered tremendously. Needless to say, this is somehow driven by sectarian affiliation and polarization.
Absolutely. This issue became a pillar, or what you call it, a given factor in journalism life, so to speak. The problem is here now that the independent media have absolutely or almost absolutely no chance to report what they see or what they happen to know about the realities in Iraq, while the protection of them by all means became less and less as shrinking.
Can I stop you here for just a second and talk about this lack of independence reporting? Since somehow there is a polarization, there is an ethnic affiliation that if you are reporting for this newspaper or for that TV station, one way or another, you are going to take the boss's political agenda into account and spin your message across. Isn't that so?
Yeah, that's right. This thing began heavily after the 22nd of February last year, after the accident or incident or in Samarra. After that moment, the whole country driven in different agenda and different line and different atmosphere. Journalists became more and more targeted because the militias on the ground from both sides, Shiis and Sunnis, take over the control and take over the initiative, military initiative from the government. Government became sided by the militias, or they turned their faces for different reasons.
In addition to the militias, Joel, that fear of death and kidnapping and ransom is not limited to journalists just about their physical security. Now there is a fear permeating the entire country of Iraq when it comes to journalism. You and I, we are going to relate a little story by Kamal Karim. I'll start it, you finish it off for me. Kamal Karim was an Iraqi from the north. He immigrated to Austria. He became a citizen of Austria, and then after the collapse of the Iraqi regime, he came back and he thought that there is democracy and there is a press freedom. He wrote a series of articles about corruption and power abuse in the north by the KDP, which belongs to Masoud al-Barazani. Tell me what happened to him next.
Well, what happened to Kamal Karim was he was arrested by Kurdish security forces in Erbil, and he was detained and taken to court. And there was essentially a summary verdict that was issued. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison for defamation. There was no due process. And essentially he was held for months in prison on these charges following an international uproar. There was international organizations like CPJ protested his imprisonment. Eventually his sentence was commuted and he was ultimately pardoned and released. But I think his imprisonment sent a very strong message to Iraqi journalists, particularly journalists in the Iraqi Kurdish regions, that criticizing powerful officials can land a journalist in prison, especially someone or even someone who has a foreign nationality. So I think what this shows is that in addition to the tremendous physical threats that journalists face, as our guests have described, journalists also face difficulties from the actions of repressive security forces. In some cases, journalists are being brought before criminal courts and being prosecuted for their writings.
It is unfortunate, Joel, that his case is not a single one, is not limited to him. Perhaps even on the other side, which is the KUP, there was this gentleman of Hawzi Hawazi. He wrote a series of articles. Apparently, he was also hauled to court, and pretty much he was going to be threatened with a long-term sentence. To what extent from the CPJ records that you see Iraqi journalists are prevented from telling their own side of the story?
Well, again, as I mentioned, predominantly the risks are threats on life and livelihood, as we're seeing through the record number of journalists being killed, but also in a number of cases, particularly in the northern Kurdish regions where there is, some semblance of a press that can operate with some degree of safety. Journalists are being pressured by security services, telephone calls from security agents pressuring them about what they write. We've had a number of cases of journalists being prosecuted by the courts on defamation charges for writing about powerful officials. One case that we documented last year involved two journalists for an independent newspaper in the north who had written that the Prime Minister had dismissed two telephone company workers because they had cut the Prime Minister's phone service for allegedly not paying the bills. They were sentenced to a number of months in prison. Fortunately, those sentences were suspended. But in many cases, laws under, or in a number of cases at least, laws that existed under Saddam Hussein are being applied against journalists, as was the case
regarding
with
this
two journalists
point, Joel Compagnie, let me get a quick reaction from Mr. Zaire. You are in the north. It's supposed to be free. It's supposed to be democratic. When you hear such stories that if people find an excuse and justification for the south and the center, how about the north? Why does these things happen?
Well, I think we have to be very clear and very decent in that. The case of Karim, Karim and the man of Hawezi. First of all, that guy, the first one, is not a journalist. He wrote comments accusing the leaders of the Kurdish region by being agents and spies and take salaries from CIA and something like that openly. And he came and he challenged those people in power. And they do simply the legal line, and they put him in prison and they send him to court. I think facing the law is something very important for us as a journalist. And I do believe there is a big mistake in putting him in prison 31 years. But I do believe his case is not really the best thing to talk about the protection of journalism.
Thank you, Ismail Zaire. We'll take a short break now. When we come back, I'm going to ask John Burns whether the training on Hell on Earth really will help journalists. Stay with us.
Now it's just numbers. Such and such people were killed. Reporters rarely mention militias or the failures of the government. If they do, they get killed. Omar Fakiki, Iraqi journalist, Washington Post.